It's an Archaeodeath interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings. Finally, we meet on Archaeodeath. Archaeosoup is in the house.
Yes,
Archaeosoup versus Archaeodeath. It's finally happening on my channel.
yes.
Finally, the circle is complete. Once you were the master. Anyway, sorry, I was going to do a short introduction already. I've got off piste into ramblings, but I'm starstruck. It's the ultimate Archaeosoup is here. Welcome, Mark, and I'm wearing my Archaeosoup merch for
Yeah.
the occasion.
Yep.
And I'm just really excited to, because obviously you've been very generous in letting me come on your show a couple of times, or more than a couple of times, and I wanted a chance to talk about you and also about the archaeodeathly dimensions of Archaeosoup, the mortuary mix in the soup that is your social media presence. But anyway, so hello.
Hello. I mean, actually, one of the taglines for Archaeosoup is warning may contain human remains. So
Exactly.
it is right there, isn't it? And in that sense, I am curious on that note as to what it is you make, and maybe archaeologists should make of, for example, the Archaeosoup logo. I get like very early on when I designed that thing, I uh, I didn't really think about it as being grim. And then, when you meet the public, or when you go into a primary school or something, and the teacher just goes, "That's a bit intense, isn't it? A skull in a bowl of soup." Um, and and yeah, I don't know. It's
It's
interesting.
6-year-olds going, "Do you eat those?"
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So yeah, I mean, obviously we'll talk about this, but that line, I guess, isn't it, between interacting with and having a respect for the dead is a curious one, and it's right
It's
there in the logo. Mm,
it's fascinating, and yes, I mean we can't avoid death in
mm,
archaeology,
mhm,
and a channel that is as far-ranging as yours touches it in many ways. So I want to come to that, but I would love to start, Mark, if I may, by
mhm.
asking you about origins. Where did the Archaeosoup come from? What gave you the idea? Who were you before?
Well, interestingly, not that long ago, I did a similar interview um, with someone else, and I'm just conscious that I don't want to be repeating myself too much for people. But what I will say is I'll give you a slightly different answer. I'll be sort of Joker-esque, and have multiple choice
Yes.
origin stories. No. I'll elaborate on a different aspect of it, and that is that what the first real seed of interest in doing what I do came about through observing my colleagues. It was in the second year at university, and due to illness, I'd missed out on the formal teaching gig experience in that previous summer. So over Christmas and into New Year, I was hanging out with the what was called ASUD, Archaeological Services, University of Durham. They still exist, but they've changed their name a little bit. Digging in South Shields, and it's now, if anyone knows South Shields, a place called no, sorry, a place. It's a supermarket called Asda, just opposite a church. And we've been excavating ahead of this development in order to see where grave furniture was in the landscape, because during the Second World War, the churchyard had been hit by a bomb. It had scattered material, stones, coffins, human remains all over the place, and they had just shoved it all back in the ground, patted it down, and put a cobble road over it. And obviously, as they didn't want to have, human remains under the freezer section, so we were there looking at that stuff. And what I found interesting was the way in which uh, good archaeologists, solid diggers, solid in terms of the understanding of what they were looking at and how they were going about their methodology. Nonetheless, we're a little bit wary and weary of bumping into the public and having the public come on over. And there was these two old ladies in particular one day, I remember, who just going, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" That kind of thing. And Al, I'll say his name. Al says, "Oh, can't be asked with this. You go and talk to them at the fence." So I went over and had a chat, and I was explaining what we were doing, And what was interesting was that they were asking because they knew, they knew that there were probably bits of people and graves and gravestones scattered because they had been young when the bomb
Yeah.
landed, and they were curious because they had members of their family in that graveyard. It wasn't just have you found any treasure? It was a genuine query as to uh, almost, have you recovered potentially members of our family? Are you going to be putting
Yeah.
them to rest? Are you looking after them, basically? And walking them through what we were doing, how we were doing it, and why we were doing it, really put them at ease. And so they went away, and then 10 minutes later came back from Greg's with sausage rolls for us all. And and the archaeologists on the team were really happy, chuffed at getting these baked goods. But I learned a lesson, and that was not to do what I saw a little bit of that jaded kind of approach to non-specialists or lay people creeping in, with that team. That said, though, Al is a very human, wonderful, bear of a man, a fantastic archaeologist, and he is a lovely guy. It's just on that day he was in a bit of a grump.
Yeah.
But I think, what I thought, though, and what stayed with me, was the need to be aware, and in that sense, hold on to that reality, that what you're doing is not, it's not a process as my friend and colleague Andy often says, it's not, we shouldn't be doing archaeology to people. Rather, if you especially if you're turning up in someone else's community, it should be, as much as possible, open to some sort of collaborative storytelling. And that's basically where the idea of Archaeosoup came from. Many years later, I would be desperately looking for work, and found myself starting a YouTube channel to stay sane. And out of that came what became Archaeosoup. But really, the kernel of inspiration um, was, having gained a bit of knowledge at university, now seeing things from the other side of that fence. Because as a kid, I'd always been on the other side, but realizing that it was necessary to keep the dialogue open, and be open uh, to the humanity of it. Mm.
Fantastic answer. So, as Archaeosoup developed,
Mm.
was it first of all on YouTube and then spread out? Was that the sequence to other social media? Because I realise Archaeosoup Productions now is a multi-platform phenomenon.
Yeah.
Do you like the way I said that? It's like kind of very corporate type thing.
Yeah, it sounded sort of Disney Plus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Archaeosoup started out actually started out as a series of YouTube videos called The A to Z of Archaeology. And something I often forget, and actually I forgot in this recent interview, so this is something else that you're getting exclusive, is that within the first year, yeah, it was about a year actually into doing Archaeosoup, I one afternoon accidentally deleted the whole library of, I think I was up to the letter O in the alphabet. So I'd done all the way through, osteology, I think, is O, and I'd just done O, and I was planning the next one, and somehow, I don't know how, I hovered over and clicked the wrong thing, and then confirmed the wrong thing, and
No.
everything was deleted. And Mrs. Soup, my lovely wife, came home and, in her words, found me basically catatonic. I was just on the sofa, just gently rocking back and forward. Like, what have I done? But it was actually interesting. It was
Oh,
yeah, it was interesting because actually by that point, I was starting to get a little bit of an audience, and some really nice feedback. There was one gentleman in particular in the US who, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, is no longer with us. But he was very supportive in those early weeks and months, uh, and I just thought, okay, I'm just gonna have to start again. And thankfully, I still have my notes from most of the A to O, so I just
well, that's
began again. And
something.
yeah, so it started with this A to Z thing, and then started adding on, questions. If people had questions, I'd try and answer them. Eventually, I took the opportunity to interview an archaeologist who had dug at Segadunum in Wall's End, and and that out of that came, you know, a series of interviews with archaeologists and trying to describe to the public what is being an archaeologist. Because I mean, even just between you and me, there's a tremendous divergence in what archaeology is, what it means, and what it means to do archaeology. So yeah, all that sort of stuff came about. And I suppose what I would say is I enjoy weaving in humor uh, with rigor in order to produce the particular piquant flavor that is Archaeosoup. So as much as I do, you know, do make jokes and present things with a tongue in cheek. It's interesting, and I don't. Well, actually, I do know about some of your experience on, for example, TikTok. Um, but it's interesting how many people presume that you've put no thought into what it is that you're doing and saying, and will just go, well, actually, blah 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 blah, and you just go, actually, no,
Yeah.
like, you know, this is a very carefully thought out, you know,
Yeah,
answer
yeah.
or video essay, and so it's yeah, it started there, and it became this broader thing, and involves, you know, workshops and um lectures and public events, uh, uh, commissioned film work, all sorts of stuff. Um, but it's been a curious experience. Yeah, definitely. So I feel as though I'm rambling there.
No,
Like,
I mean, so a range of different content, different
mm,
formats, different styles, you know, series.
mhm,
I mean, has there been any trends in terms? Obviously, you're now up to the amazing heights of subscriberdom of, you know, 27,000, something like that, isn't it? It's really, you know, a substantial, you know, presence, and you know, and it's long-term
mm,
incremental development, or how does it work on YouTube? Did you hit a point where you went, vroom, you know, where everyone
mm,
suddenly was watching your stuff? Was there a like a
mm.
made it moment, or was it just an incremental, you know, slog to success?
It's been very incremental, and to be fair, uh, you know, for example, compared to your numbers on TikTok, or compared to even actually uh, other archaeology, history, and heritage news and education YouTube channels. Actually, Archaeosoup isn't that big. You know, it's been
Oh,
going for 14 years now. But there are channels which maybe have been going for 5 years that have, you know, 750,000 subscribers. So I mean, it's sometimes I feel as though I wonder what did I do wrong? Like, you know, like how did it not catch that sort of pace? But that said, though, I wouldn't change anything about how I do Archaeosoup, because I feel as though every time I even hint that I'm, you know, that I might be stopping for a while, if that ever happens. People say, "Oh, no, but it's really useful. It's been really, you know, it's a really important
yeah.
part of, you know, it's a brick that's important in that wall," and that's lovely and wonderful. And I suppose it's interesting then that this idea of was there like a tipping point? Um, no, and for my part, that's been probably quite good for me, actually, because I think if I'd suddenly had a massive influx of people, I would have felt even more pressure to put out stuff that I would think that they would want to see.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. One video might make it, oh, they all want that, do they? And
yeah,
then,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, at one point, YouTube was telling me, um, I mean, and it still is the most watched video on Archaeosoup is a former video I did about Utsi the Iceman, and YouTube was saying, just do more Utsi, and I was like, I can't become the Utsi channel, like, you know, that's not possible. So it's I'm still trying to crack that nut in terms of, you know, reach, but obviously, I mean, you've certainly gathered a lot of pace on TikTok, partly I think because of your mixture of personality and rigor, actually. I
I,
mean,
I,
how do you feel about these numbers in that sense?
well, I don't know what to believe about them, but I certainly think that having a long term what I was asking, I mean, I'm still trying to struggle to understand it, to be honest, and I don't know how much it means, because, but it's nice to have an audit. But I do think that regardless of the detailed numbers, um, you know, I think Archaeosoup is more than just a resource. It's a phenomenon that is such a part of multiple generations of undergraduates and enthusiast interest. So whether I engage with it or not, my students will be. It's their go-to place in many ways. Yes, they're aware of some of these other bigger channels, but they're not mentioning them. There is a sense of well-earned and long-term sort of authority that comes with that. That whether you like it or not, there is a sense, I feel, within the archaeology community of students at least, and elsewhere amongst academics too, there is a sense that you are a lasting phenomenon, an enduring presence, like a megalith. It's like
or like a gnarled tree in the field. Like, she's always been there. We climb on that tree.
There is a but I think there is a sense that because so much social media is often castigated as short-termism and disposable, I think actually, there's no non-digital product, perhaps some long-running textbooks, that has a similar enduring influence. And that's where I was going to say that I shared with you recently, but I'm reviewing it as a pre-publication or just published copy, the 6th edition of Archaeology: An Introduction by Hannah Cobb, Kevin Green and Tom Moore. And I have absolute confession to make that I never used this as an undergraduate beyond the first year. I used the short loan collection copy. I never bought it from the library at Sheffield when I was an undergraduate, but I never really used this as a textbook. But this third version is actually got an interesting set of editions. It's it's interesting to see how would I synopsize down whole fields of complex archaeological work. And I'm not saying I approve of the selection of choices in this book, but where they hit it right is on page 357, where I fully approve of their citation of an article and another set of papers that you produced as part of an edited collection that I put together with a student, Afnan, and a colleague, Caroline, from a student conference, Public Archaeology, Arts of Engagement, in which your chapter addresses your YouTube channel. And I think it's only a small citation in a big textbook, but I think it's really slow in coming. And given that you get more citations than, we get collectively as much attention as the whole field of pseudo-archaeology does in this book. And there's other things that are, because every textbook has its biases. There are other things that I think are quite big topics, but are here synopsized in quite short sections. I'm quite honoured that we your work gets the attention it does. I think, it's that enduring presence as an example. It may have taken 14 years to finally get a citation in a bleeding textbook, and that may not be a great endorsement, but it shows that recognition that
well, and I should say, and this is where that need for comparing the different paths that different archaeologists go on, I think it has been necessary, in so much as that was only possible because obviously you invited me and others to write chapters for this collection, but you were doing it precisely because other outlets simply weren't recognizing that there is actually resources to be tapped there. So from people who do podcasts or people who do but I suppose it's the broader label is new media, isn't it? And it was sort of being ignored. And also it was interesting as well that that even if I seem to recall some of the reviews for that collected volume seemed to miss the point, unfortunately. And obviously you may not want to directly comment on it as an impartial editor of it, but I certainly found myself going, you need to go back and read it, like actually read it, because I think one of the reviews I'm paraphrasing here was something along the lines of essentially yes and it's like, right, you haven't read it then, have you? You're just presuming this is akin to cat videos and nonsense that people caricaturize as being on YouTube, TikTok, and so on. So But
Well, I
but
think,
yeah, so come
well, I was going to say that one could say, and well, it's my channel. I can say it. My interview, I can proclaim that if you look at the literature on public archaeology up to about 2017, there are some dedicated work, evaluations of digital public archaeology, some theoretical and some broad generalizations. But there were no attempts to really there was only a few attempts to take long-term, established, sustainable public engagement, education, and reflect on digital aspects. And even now, in 2024, in the way that academics think about public archaeology, I'm afraid, and I'm not dismissing this at all because I know you do this too, that they're still thinking about, oh, let's work with 5 school kids. Oh, let's work with a bunch of old people from down the village. And there's nothing wrong with that. But while simultaneously whining about how archaeology is too white and too middle class, they'll just go, and here's another exciting project we did with an affluent areas primary school. And I'm, as I said, I'll repeat, I'm not dissing that work, but when you can reach audiences internationally, as you've done, it's not about numbers, it's about that long-term rich engagement. This is exactly the kind of thing that people poo-poo and dismiss digital media as not being able to do, but you've been able to achieve it and sustain it. And that's the thing that I think is really, there's almost a snobbery against the digital, but a snobbery against the informal. There's all sorts of snobberies that coalesce in this regard. And so if a whole subfield of archaeology can't muster multiple PhDs evaluating this yet, there is still something to be done. So I find it shocking that, that it hasn't had that attention. No, you're not reaching audiences the same size as Time Team or Digging for Britain, but it's not the same game. It's not the same genre. It's not about competing with how many celebrity Dan Snow interviews you can get on or whatever it may be, or it's a different phenomena, and it has integrity because it's you and you're informed, but I'm not saying eclectic in a bad way, but far ranging. It's sometimes eclectic, and I think that's a real. Oh no, that's my feeling. I don't know.
No. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I think about the academic, but also your sort of jobbing, working archaeological reaction to so-called public archaeology, I'll be honest. In recent years, I found myself wondering, and I think I've even messaged you occasionally, suggesting a question, and that is, has the experiment failed in some respects? What was it that this thing that people were calling public archaeology, which came to be called public archaeology, was trying to achieve? And initially, I remember there were lots of conversations about helping local history groups, helping local communities, helping individuals and institutions to be able to engage with each other on what was initially a relatively new thing. I mean, Facebook only really got going into 2006. It was only really publicly accessible, I think, 2008 possibly. It's for lots of people. I remember when I was working for the National Trust for 18 months. At one point, I was covering someone's maternity leave, and I was writing what became a regional handbook on social media, and the first book for that on that topic, first guide. And one of the things that I was pointing out was that increasingly people were just expecting that even Pedigree Chum, a dog food, would have a Facebook page. You can't, increasingly you couldn't get away with not being engaging in that way. But it feels as though a moment, a prolonged moment of figuring out what this meant to have personal, professional, institutional, and brand social personalities in these spaces, figuring out what that meant, eventually sort of standardized in a way that it sort of fossilized in a way that was eventually came back, ironically enough, around to being inaccessible, oddly. And in the realm of archaeology, I've been I am often disappointed, and I think I made it clear in that chapter that I wrote, that unfortunately, lots of the conversation around this does tend to be how can we glean either glean mass data analysis from the public, on a voluntary basis, or how can we use these numbers to prove a grant application is worthwhile doing? Basically, essentially, almost missing the point of social media, as opposed to it being a transactional interaction, which extends also up into the realm of dissemination of knowledge. I am quite disappointed still that one of the key concerns appears to be the maintaining authority, as opposed to naturally, organically, cultivating trust. And I mean, this is something which came out in an interview that I did with or a conversation that I had with my colleague Andy a little while ago, was that contrast between authority and trust, and the fact that if you are trusted, you can become an authority. But if you're authoritarian in terms of how you do your social media, I suspect you're more likely to be looked at with a slight side eye. People will think that you want to control them and what they think and what they can and cannot say about the past and that kind of thing. So that's always been important for me, because I mean, I remember early on with the Archaeosoup YouTube channel, someone pointed out that I tended to frame the camera low down, slightly looking up, and I didn't realize I was doing this. I think I was doing it to frame something behind me. But he said, and that gives us that, he was sort of praising this. He was saying, oh, that gives us the impression of we're looking up at a wise individual, um, and once he told me that, I deliberately reframed it so it was more or less dead on. I changed where I was in the frame, but I wanted to meet people where they were at, and hopefully have those conversations unfold on a mutual basis, as opposed to just being, the guy who looks like a stereotypical, archaeological academic type, beardy, books behind him, this kind of thing, telling you what you should think about the past. So yeah, that's been
That's
an
a
interesting.
really good. Sorry, that's a really good point. I've seen that raised recently with various manosphere creators who adopt a position of power in videos to talk about all manner of authoritative topics, like what women want and all sorts of these garbage takes, but they're always standing. So I think I'm going to do the great dictator sort of Chaplin thing of sort of higher and higher, so bow
Eventually
down
we'll
before, But no, it is a real interesting, we've got to think critically about these things, but also we don't, when we get feedback like that, you took it and subverted it to something positive, even if it was, they meant it positive, but it wasn't what you wanted. It made you uncomfortable, didn't it? And then you sort of think, and so you're getting constant feedback, dialogue is, I mean, the dialogue is often positive though, isn't it? We often focus on the negative, but there's do you find there is engagement, or is it predictable what people will say on individual topics?
It's not predictable, no. And that's fantastic. It's one of my favorite things about when it's working properly, this whole notion of public archaeology, is that people can come to you with seemingly the most mundane question that actually can be incredibly profound. I've talked about this in other places. This interaction I had with a girl in a primary school setting, where she asked what appeared to be a very easy question to answer. She said, "Do we know anyone's name?"
Oh yes,
from the Paleolithic. And my response was no, not really, no, because there was no written language at that point. We don't really know. And it was only on the way home that I recalled research that had just been published about so-called hyperconserved words, or the potential for hyperconserved words. I think there's 40-something, 48 maybe words that linguists had been looking at and suggesting they might have roots back to around 15,000 years ago. And so off the back of that, I made a little video, initially just for the class, then I made it public for other people to watch, laying this out, thanking her for her question, and inviting the class and everyone at home to maybe write a little story using these words, or come up with a conversation, maybe a back and forth between two prehistoric people using this language. And that wouldn't have happened were it not for someone asking what appears to be potentially an obvious question, or a question with an obvious answer. But also, so yeah, it starts there, but also all the way up to, I regularly getting wonderful comments from students, thanking me for putting information out there and helping them with their essays and this kind of thing, without really what I should say is I've never wanted to be a cheat sheet. So throughout the stuff that I've done, I've always tried to just present ideas to inspire thought.
Yes.
And you
don't want to be what you need to know to get your GCSE is
exactly.
my YouTube channel, or whatever it may be.
Are you trying to do the bare minimum to get that essay written for Howard Williams? This is what you need to know. No, that's exactly not what I've wanted to do, but thankfully in those instances people seem to respond to that as moments of little sparks in the brain, and that's it at its best, I think. And I'm sure presumably you must have very similar, well, it looks like you do have very similar interactions across the board.
Real takes my brain into different territory, and I'm forced to learn about things I never had. Or I for example, I'll give you one I haven't shared yet, but it's a site I'm well familiar with, and in an edited book I did in 2016, one of the chapter contributors is about this site on the Freed African Cemetery in Rupert Valley in St Helena, and but I've never done a video on it, and I would normally see it outside of my, even though I've got the monograph sitting right here, I'd never see it within my purview to do that, because it's such a sensitive topic for a global audience. But a mutual of colour has asked me to comment on another video, and I said, well, I've got the report, I can tell you about the finds. I won't show human remains in this instance, but I will talk about the artifact. So just to give you an example of the kind of thing where questions, or not necessarily a question put to me, but a kind of invitation on a very sensitive topic from a quarter which I respect, of someone who is of the African diaspora. And I asked back, well, would you think it would be appropriate to do? Would that be of interest? Well, no one knows about this. So do it. I mean, it's encouraging me to address topics I wouldn't have otherwise thought were appropriate. And that gets pushed back, but that's the way it goes. But most of the time it's really positive.
I mean, that it's interesting as well, because that, speaking of the African diaspora, in that sense, one of the things I find fascinating about talking about prehistory in particular is those negative interactions with people who don't want to admit that to a certain extent we are all African diaspora, and that's, I don't mean that's such as to say that I can go around being a Rastafarian. Obviously there are there are limits and sensitivities, but the point being is that this shared human story is one that I think at its best is one that people from across the world can relate to. So on a similar note, there was a video I did about the Lalibela or Lalibela churches in Ethiopia. These churches carved out of stone, and it was
amazing.
A beautiful area, but also wonderful in terms of its connections to the medieval Near East and Middle East, and through into Europe. And on the same video, it's interesting how you can have people both from modern Ethiopia, people from the US, often people from Europe in particular, commenting, trying to imply what might be because I sound, they'll call me an Englishman, what this Englishman is doing, talking about this this site? Are you suggesting that that we need your opinion from over there? And so some people will say that, but then at the same time, in the same batch of comments, there will be local people saying, "Thank you so much for taking an interest, and for sharing some of the." And so one thing I definitely have, I've tried to incorporate more and more into my learning and into my presentation is having an implied sense of I don't know, almost a permission to talk about other places, I guess. So Angkor Wat would be another example where obviously I'm not from the area, but it's a fascinating site. And so I try to, in the narrative and in the presentation, present it as here's something really cool, as opposed to here's something that that we know everything about because we're from the West. It's more a case of here's something that actually I didn't know about, until I went to uni. Here's something really cool. So, but and at its best, that I think that's where people will meet you, is actually with that sort of shared curiosity, and in particular, if you're not, going around saying that the other parts of the world need you to interpret their sites for them, which is definitely not something I'm saying.
That's a really good point about the
mm,
sensitivities that one has to navigate when doing this kind of
mm,
content. And have you had? I mean, there's lots of highs of positive engagement, and and you get to learn on the journey about things you, as you said, you haven't otherwise
mm,
worked through. What
mm.
about, I mean, in terms of the lows or the negatives, have you had particular statements that your questions or issues where you've had a flood of the public outraged at your perspective, or are we going to stay with the slave trade for that one? Following one of your recent videos, or is it
Mm,
more again a trickle? Was there some
mm.
particular flashpoints where you've had to tackle some broader debates?
I mean, the one that I there's probably the biggest one for me was one that happened fairly early on, and that was the Bosnian pyramids.
Oh, of course, you
Um,
mentioned that in your chapter from
yeah,
2019, don't you?
yeah,
Yes, of
yeah,
course.
yeah.
Poo in the
Um,
post.
per in the post, exactly. Yeah, and a seemingly annoying, in particular, tea towel salesman in the area around those pyramids, those pyramidal shaped mountains. I think no, there's never really been a pile on in particular in any particular excuse me, topic uh, or instance, but there are themes, and I think often what will come out will be uh, and this is something that I think I revel in being able to challenge, but also at the same time can be a bit tiring. Is this theme of looking at me, taking me at face value, and presuming that, for example, I'm going to be a totally, in love with Northern Europe to the point that I believe that Northern Europeans are somehow special and unique, and the blood and soil Viking types, this kind of thing that definitely turn up at your doorstep. I know that, but yeah, that sort of thing. That's probably the one that I find most consistently as a trickle that never really goes away. Is this thing of either wanting you to say something that's incorrect about essentially cultural hierarchy, shall we say, if not racial hierarchy, um, or people actually actively calling you out as some sort of betrayer of a narrative. And again, at its worst, sometimes people will talk about it as in a racial sense, betraying your racial roots. But as difficult as that can be sometimes, it's never been enough to make the good stuff seem not worth it. It's always worth it. And I mean, as you just pointed out, yeah, recently there was a video I made on TikTok, which was talking about the transatlantic slave trade, and just the simple fact that we can't, uh, Britain in particular, can't just say everything's fine, and we did, we ended slavery. That's basically the topic of that video is this question of, well, we ended slavery, so what is there to talk about? And the answer is the fact that there was the most immensely intricate industrial version of slavery that humanity's ever produced happened because of Britain, and the fact that things like the Bank of England, the modern monarchy, we're investors in this stuff. Everything we think of as being good in many respects in Britain has been touched by that, and that's the fact that you can have that conversation, and I try to encourage a conversation that says it's been touched by it, but that doesn't mean it's all bad. It doesn't mean that you personally have to, whip yourself every day. It's more a case of you just can't expect history just to be, if even if it wasn't to do with slavery, if it was just about national identity, the French will have a different opinion of Britain than Britain has of itself by definition.
What do they know?
Yeah. And so I think having a broader view of history and histories plural can actually be a wonderful thing. It also means that at times you've got to do some learning, and that learning may well involve a little bit of humble pie, and but again, people will often look at this face and this beard, and and they just presume that I'm going to be like, oh yes, rule Britannia, that kind of thing. And I find that fascinating, definitely.
So, what do you think is been your greatest success on social media, public engagement, in terms of not necessarily scale, but moment where you felt you'd made an achievement, some connection, or some,
I often joke, and I really hope this isn't my last thought on Earth.
No.
I really hope, but I often joke that I will die having still hearing people talking about ancient aliens. In that sense, the needle will never move really that far. But I really hope it's not my last thought now, because every now and then I make this joke and I'm just like, please, whatever you do, like think about lovely people. Don't go, oh no, and then go leave this mortal coil. So in that sense, this idea of an achievement, I think for many archaeologists working in the public sphere, tends to be around dispelling common myths and misunderstandings, and trying to explain the reasons why those are misunderstandings. And that's commendable, and it's something which I do and have done, and will no doubt do again. But actually, the stuff that I'm most proud of is the stuff that I've been doing with Andy, actually, on Watching Brief, and without going into gross detail, instances where we've highlighted some of the weirdness of the way in which archaeology is done in this country in particular, has really I've been very proud of, because it's stuff that sometimes I know there are people who often comment and contact us and confirm this. Sometimes you can feel as though you're going mad when you're sort of thinking, you go, hang on. For example, very broadly, hang on, this institution, this organization is talking about the need for diversity, and yet they're shutting everything down that they don't like. Like,
yeah.
What? This community won't. You can only post, for example, on this particular Facebook group if you go through the person in charge of the Facebook group. What? How? And then that. Yeah, but I hope that's that sort of thing, if not actually leading to change, at the very least provides a pressure valve for people to feel as though there actually is a conversation to be had about how archaeology is done. Because I think, and this goes all the way back to that experience in South Shields, I think there's a tendency for people to reach a certain point in the archaeological establishment, I guess you could say, where they're just very comfortable, and they like the idea that archaeology is harmless, and that it's safe, and that it's comfortable, and that it's something that really isn't particularly controversial. Um, and yet evidence to the contrary is everywhere. I mean, we're all the way down to something as simple as the fact that, you know, every political statement made by anyone running in an election tends to be a vision for the future based on the state of the world today in the context of a shared understanding of our past. More often than not, that's what happens. And people draw a trajectory of like, oh, well, England used to be this, and now we're going to be that. Um, Archaeology is, by definition, sticky and used by people for different reasons. And I feel as though sometimes people in charge of archaeology just don't want to admit it. So I'm proud of the fact that sometimes there've been one or two instances where we've given given some people a slightly bloody nose, and then we've been blocked on Twitter.
That's no bad thing. Badge of honor.
Yeah, badge of honor. Yeah. But it's a shame, though. It's a shame because in a I think in a profession that's working properly, people of a certain status should expect questions.
Yes.
You know, and they should be prepared to answer those questions in a way that's not trying to obfuscate. Because ultimately it is just archaeology, folks. I mean, I say archaeology is political. It's also not. It's not a Le Carre novel. You know, it's not a deep web of intrigue. And as much as yes, there are issues of intellectual property rights around individual excavations sometimes. It's a bit weird the way that for example, the Council of British Archaeology, CIFA, and others will sometimes talk about how they're having lots of meetings, but they just can't tell us what those meetings are about. You know, they're talking to people in government, but we can't really divulge that stuff. And
like Indiana Jones line, isn't it?
Well, exactly.
Top men.
Yeah, which top men? Top men. Yeah, and yeah, fools. But the issue there being between you, me, and the fence post, they seem to forget that records of who meets who in Whitehall are publicly available. I'll just leave that there. At some point, we may be returning to that sort of stuff on Watching Brief. But it's all. I suppose ultimately, it's about the quality of what being an archaeologist is, and as much as yes, in my broadest, most accessible sense, Archaeosoup is about accessible, interesting information. Increasingly, I've been fascinated by the relationship between academics, which I would class myself as other, even though I have a very academic approach to archaeology, diggers, and the public, and this relationship and how it crisses and crosses in media spaces, and how there's often a lot of attempts at damage control. I mean, I sometimes feel as though some of these social media groups, group chats that surround some of this stuff must just spend their days thinking that they're fighting fires. When I just feel as though sometimes those fires are not fires, what they are is a yearning for a conversation, and a yearning for some sort of openness that some people just aren't ready to embrace. I know I'm speaking sort of in riddles and a little bit in code, but I also don't want to badmouth people. I'm just interested in that quality. What is the quality of the profession, and also what we want good paying conditions. We want people in power to pay attention to archaeological opinions on landscape. What are we doing to give those people that immediate thought? Because I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but
it's about the challenges of this media as well, which is absolutely essential and relevant.
Well, but also very particularly the Stonehenge tunnel discussion that's ongoing. People like Alice Roberts tweet out along the lines of, it's this despicable that this newspaper article hasn't quoted a single archaeologist. You know, they've talked to locals, they've talked to people from campaign groups, they've talked, yeah, they haven't talked to a single archaeologist. And what's fascinating to me is that archaeologists seem to forget that for most people, I dare say, Stonehenge is not a matter of archaeology. That's the thing that I think a lot of archaeologists just forget. Stonehenge is a cultural icon. It's a landscape visitor attraction. It's part of a civil engineering dispute. It is of local and national and international interest. But no one, like someone visiting from Japan, for example, I saw footage of someone that I follow on YouTube visiting the site, and everything they were saying was historically wrong. Like they were just sort of talking about Merlin and all this sort of stuff, and I thought it's fine that they're engaging with the monument, and they loved it without a single thought as to what an archaeologist might think of that landscape. And this is the thing that if you want that quality, if you want the quality of being authoritative, and we come back to authority and trust, I suppose here, then you need to build that trust. You need to be a voice that is accessible and that is transparent and that can be listened to. And just complaining. I'm not saying that Alice is getting this wrong in particular, but her statement on this, I think, was incorrect. Just complaining that archaeologists aren't being listened to isn't enough. Archaeology as a whole, because obviously she's quite a public engaged face. Archaeology as a whole needs to get better at being that, so that they are the first thing people think of in the archaeological landscape, if that's what we want, if that's what we want. But yeah, it's
a topic we've addressed many times, is that there's a great reticence for a range of reasons, many of them justifiable, about the true horror of potential pylons, threats, abuse of making public statements. And yet there's never been a time where we need to not just be you, me, and a couple of others. It needs to be a broader community engaging in a broader way, not just liking the occasional tweet or, oh, I saw your Facebook post 7 days ago about this really important issue. But to try and get people involved. And I got into trouble recently on TikTok for simply replying to someone saying they don't like my face and my voice by saying, well, come on, do some videos, or if not, leave some constructive comments. Apparently this was bullying them, and they're very angry at me. But I stand by my point, is criticize what I do. Sure, I no one's above criticism, but if you're not even leaving a constructive question, and I haven't seen their face on any of the other videos I did or anyone else's, what are you doing about this? Someone asked me today, why are you just combating Graham Hancock with general statements? Why aren't you digging into the fascinating details he goes into in the Netflix show? I want to see your videos on that. And I just replied, I'd love to see your videos on that. I have no aspiration of watching that docu-series, if that's a polite name for it. I've no time, and actually, if someone paid me, say, $1,000 an episode to do a YouTube video, then I'll do it. But until then, you get what I can cope with, and this is more than I used to be able to cope with, But anyway, I'm just saying it's hard work to do all this, and the more people we have engaging, the better.
Yeah, well, but also I feel as though the more because archaeologists, the culture of archaeology is often is one of and just leave me be, just let me do my study. I don't want to be, I don't necessarily want to be having to think about these bigger issues, and I don't expect all archaeologists to have to do that sort of work or engagement. I definitely don't. But it's this issue of wanting your cake and eat it when it comes to that notion of authority.
Yeah, why won't they take me seriously?
Yeah,
while I do this work that no one knows about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I did a PhD on medieval safety pins. Why does no one Why is no one contacting me? Well, probably because you don't really talk about your research publicly. But also on that front of Hancock and Ancient Apocalypse, I did watch the whole thing, and then
well done.
I've reviewed it on Watching Brief, and what I would say about the most recent developments there with the Flint Dibble conversation, ironically, I can't quite bring myself to listen to all of that. You see, I watched the Ancient Apocalypse series. I've followed the story of the Gunung Padang paper being
Oh yes, I saw all that on Watching Brief.
being
Yes,
refuted and what's the word? Not redacted, unpublished, whatever.
yeah, but still fully available on our
Yep.
respected journal's website. I don't get
Well,
it. I don't.
no, exactly. Yeah. But what I would say about
Yeah,
the Flint Dibble thing
sorry.
is that no, not at all. Is that a little part of me does wonder whether that is actually necessary. You know, in so much as I know a lot of discourse has happened around ancient apocalypse and some of the other work of Graham Hancock, but you surely get to a point where you are the equivalent of, I don't know, the head of NASA being asked to sit down and talk to someone who is insisting that the Earth is flat or insisting that the moon is made of cheese. You know,
Yeah.
the burden of proof has to be on those people. And if they're not, the one good thing about the Gunung Padang paper was that this was an area, a situation where he actually did have to play within the playground and within
Yes.
shared established rules that others who try and publish in journals have to abide by. Somehow it got through peer review. That I don't think we're ever going to understand how that happened. But that I suppose that was quite refreshing. But I just, as much as I'm all for public archaeology and public engagement and multiplicity of voices, and it doesn't have to be positivistic. You don't have to scientifically prove everything that you're talking about. There is room for play in that sense. I do find myself just at this point thinking to what I guess, as you would sort of outlining, is there much value in going through the process of thinking about what he's saying and trying to figure out how exactly and why exactly it isn't correct, or trying to explain the bits that he's deliberately not saying? That takes so much more work.
Yeah. So for
Um,
you're not dedicating your YouTube channel to simply combating misinformation and from pseudo archaeologists or others. That's part of the mix, because you do, but you do a range of other things.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, it definitely is part of the mix. I mean, there's even a video that I did specifically about the Bosnian pyramids, returning to that topic because of that. But I suppose it feels more interesting, more honest, and more uh, uh, it has more integrity to just talk about the stuff that's interesting and real and fact. So for example, instead of saying who built Stonehenge, actually looking at that answer and saying, well, these are the people who built Stonehenge. This is there's a village just up here, Durrington Walls, and we have this stuff and we have that stuff. Actually answering the question is something which is so much more substantive than the constant never-ending asking. Oh, I'm just asking questions. The I'm just asking questions crowd is such a it's fast food. It's a sugar rush of intrigue that's designed never to be answered. And so in that sense, I think I will listen to the Flint Dibble conversation. Apparently it went quite well, apparently. And then in Hancock's own subreddit, apparently it's like 50-50 whether or not people believe. But they're always, it was going to be 50-50. It's always going to be 50. Sorry. But that whole thing of getting tied up in debating whether or not the unicorn exists feels like you're playing that game.
Mark, archaeologists have only excavated 5% of unicorn burial sites, and until you've excavated the rest. No. It's ridiculous logic.
Yeah.
No. I agree. But it does think the past matters to people, and it's not just when people are grifting huge fantastical narratives. It comes down to almost everything we look at, from humble artifacts, settlements, and burials. And in the Archaeodeath context, the one thing I wanted to press you on or explore with you is your experiences and perspective on the archaeology of death, burial, and commemoration. You've touched on it in so many different regards, from watching brief to videos to your logo. So, I mean, what's your take on archaeologists' relationship with the human remains and mortuary context that we encounter? Do you know, we need to use, we have to be responsible and respectful, but some people would say that discussing it at all is disrespectful. Others would say, yeah, they're dead, what do they care, just whip out the bones and let's have some fun exploring what they tell us, you know. And you know, I do have mixed feelings about this. You know, I flip one way or another, and I did balk at seeing a certain TV show recently where it's almost this, oh, and here we've got the bodies, and I'm thinking, oh, here we, you know. And then equally, I think some of it's a bit too precious, and I go, oh, come on, there's nothing. They're learning a lot of exciting information here. Why are people making a thing of it? So I move my goalposts all the time on this issue, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I've had to have developing thoughts on this, and it's partly to do with, in that sense, I think mortuary archaeology is instantly one of the most interesting topics. I'm not just saying that because obviously it's your interest.
That is the right answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're so interesting. It's interesting because it's a little bit like those members of the public in South Shields. It's an immediate touchstone. You know, we all know someone who has died. We all wonder about processes that surround the internment of the dead, and we all learn, frankly, legalities that we didn't know about until someone dies. You know, just in terms of your everyday experience of death is a milestone without a doubt, and it's a common touchstone. And I think the one common through thread that I've learned is that you cannot be definitive, I think, in terms of prescribing how people should or should not be with the dead, up until certain points. So for example, up on the wall there, I have 3 photos that I took of my first ever human excavation of human remains, of a grave in Poulton Abbey in Cheshire.
Hey.
And yeah, and it was a monk who was seemingly, we figured, because of the state of his teeth, but also he was buried in a position possibly holding what would have been a wooden mini sort of communion kit.
Wow.
So we think it was probably a monk. And interestingly, half the skeleton was missing because another grave cut had come through later and chopped away half of, you know, you can just imagine that grave digger going, oh no, and just cutting that stuff into the spoil quickly before the procession comes along with the next funeral. It was fascinating. I was 19 years old. It wasn't the first dead person I had seen, but it was the first skeleton I'd interacted with. And I very quickly learned simple things like, for example, this has to be more than a biological exercise. It can't just be, okay, I'm pretty sure there should be this many neck vertebrae. We found them. Yes, we found them. And then uncovering the shapes where you expect to find them in the ground. And the only way that I could, at that point, before I'd gone to university, before I'd really looked into the theory behind this stuff, the only thing I could do was to give this guy a name. Now, I won't say what name we gave him. It wasn't disrespectful, but in that sense, I've since come to believe that it's not a great idea to name your skeletons. But at the time, we named him so that we remembered that this was a person, and it was done in a way as to engender respect and a certain amount of care as we were uncovering this person's resting place. And I think the nuance that's the common thread, the nuance that's come out of this has been intent. It has to be about what is the intent behind someone's behavior. So if someone does name a skeleton, and I've seen various students contact me over the years saying, oh, here's Bob, here's Bill, here's Mohammed, what do you think? Isn't it a beautiful excavation? And they're saying it because they're proud of their work, and because they're fascinated by this moment that they're having with this skeleton. And I think you have to take that intent and meet it where it's at honestly, and maybe give them some notes on, well, okay, but don't post this as Bob, don't share this on social media as Bob. um and that's, yeah, it's again this notion of being definitive. It's hard to be definitive, I think.
Do you feel that archaeologists often get it right, or still sometimes get it wrong, or?
I think again, I think it depends on the archaeologist, but I think some archaeologists can be very prescriptive, very sort of, as you might say, holier than thou about this stuff, and oh no, we cannot have this happening. um and yet, again, with this lack of definitiveness, intent is always the key. When I look at issues, for example, surrounding the display of human remains in, say, a museum, I always come back down to individual case study. In that sense, why is it there? What's the purpose of it being there? Is it what's the reaction of the public to it? So, for example, when I was working at the Jorvik Viking Centre for a couple of years, there was a skeleton at the end of I haven't been in there since they rejigged things. At the end of the experience, there was a skeleton laid out, and he was used in that sense as a teaching opportunity to show people what is a skeleton, a teaching opportunity to talk about quality of life, so dental, arthritis, signs of disease, muscle attachments, this kind of thing. But also, as well, there was and this is where the balance tipped for me. There was a weird thing of people speculating about his life, death, and beliefs in a way that was not consistent amongst the staff. So my fellow staff members, I won't say the various things that they were saying. My various staff members, we all had basically a different story about him, but also how that would lead to conversations that were basically, look at the skeleton, and if the glass hadn't been there, people would definitely be poking it and picking. It was that kind of it's the old freak show in the circus problem.
Yeah.
And this is why I think it has to come down to intent. Today, I think on that topic, because again, this is such a broad topic. I mean, I can't give you an opinion on every single instance of
why not?
Yeah, exactly. But what I would say is that today, I think we're now living in a time when there's accessible technology that could scan and 3D print accurately, both physically and also in terms of in terms of dimension, but also in terms of color, those bones, and they could be on display.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so it's but then also as well, of course, through broader Archaeosoup activities, obviously you come into contact with various modern beliefs about the dead as well, of course. So two things come to mind briefly on that. So first of all, obviously being aware that if you're Australian Aboriginal, you don't necessarily want to be shown photographs of the dead. That's important to acknowledge and to understand. And similar cultural issues and nuances across the world. But the other thing as well, just coming back to that skeleton in York, some people would say, why is he on display? Why don't you give him a good Christian burial? And the first thing you had to say would be, well, we don't know. We don't know he's a Christian, and like he was found in this particular churchyard, but we have no idea what his beliefs were. The burial was, I think in that instance, there was some reason. I think he was buried north, south, not east, west. So there's some questions as to if that meant anything at all, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting, whenever that came up, I always used to say, and this is where talking about remains is important. Whether it had to be physically there, or there could have been a 3D printed version there, is a whole other topic. But that moment was interesting, where you could say, well, why don't you make the same suggestion for Tutankhamun? Why don't you make the same suggestion for, because we wouldn't dream of giving Tutankhamun a good Christian burial. It would be grossly
It's what he would have
inappropriate.
wanted.
Yeah, exactly. It's what he would have wanted. So that in that sense, the opportunity to bring up these topics with the public is invaluable. But I feel as though from that first skeleton, through various interactions with both personally with the dead, but also with people's handling of the dead, I think it always has to come down to intent. And of course, we've seen in recent years, big drama happening on social media around the sale of human remains, haven't we? And this kind of thing. Um, and uh, what you might find interesting here is I was having a conversation with Louisa Gidney. You may or may not know that name. She was
Oh,
my essentially she was a she wasn't teaching staff, but she was technology staff at the university,
oh,
uh, helping us handle animal remains and human remains. And to this day, she does work with animal bones. She's often called upon to work through people's collections and this kind of thing, and help to write the reports. And I was talking to her about some of these issues the other day. We were at the same event, and a very public event where she was wearing this sort of cloak that was embroidered with silver thread of on her back of an aurochs skull of this cloak that she had made. It was beautiful. Anyway, we were talking about bones, and this topic of the sale of human remains came up, and she gave me an interesting insight where she said, "What you've got to remember though is the sheer number of medical skeletons that are current in the US. Uh, the sheer number of medical schools and both teaching and also diagnostic tools that we used, and the fact that people, for better or worse, either gave their remains over upon their death in return for good medical treatment leading up to their death. Sometimes they couldn't afford it, so they would sort of make a bargain, or in other ways, they essentially were kind of saying, I don't, use me. You can use my bones however you want to, this kind of thing. You can just use them. I won't be there. And she was saying how that's really, really very important to acknowledge in some of this conversation about the movement of human remains, because we can't impose upon those remains the same sort of but
yeah.
how do we know that they're not and she slightly tongue-in-cheek had this sort of hypothetical person in mind who was saying to her, but what if they're they're First Nation, or what if they're Aboriginal skeletons or something like that? Shouldn't we be returning them to their place of origin? And she's saying yes, but for the most part, some of the remains that she had been consulted on had been well documented and their origins were known. And she said, ultimately, what do you do with those bones? The owner of the skeleton wasn't expecting those remains to be buried. The families of those skeletons often are not traceable. And so for her mind, she actually then went on to introduce me to there's an artist in New York who uses human remains in their art.
Oh,
And she said, well, yeah, and well, but what this is what I found interesting about it. And this is as an addition to this question of intent. She said, ethically, in that sense, she had no problem with that usage, because
oh,
she definitely wouldn't want just to see the bones chucked out.
no,
She wouldn't want to see them on in a skip, for example.
yeah,
And if there's no funds, if there's no pathway for these, because in medical schools, which are now often replacing bones with polyurethane skeletons, this kind of thing, and rubberized tendon ligaments and all that sort of stuff. The question is, what do you do with them? And that was a fascinating uh, sort of flip side to what was an interesting conversation that we saw unfolding on TikTok a few years ago, a couple of years ago, about the sale of remains, particularly in places like New York. Because undoubtedly some of those remains were being sold on the basis of, oh, this is an Inuit skull, ha ha ha, or an Eskimo, or however they were describing it inappropriately. Um, Whereas she said, yeah, and I think this interaction with as many voices on human remains as possible is bound to be good for your ability to discern, I guess, intent as well. And so,
absolutely.
yeah, and so in that instance, I think I'm still not sure what I think about what she said, but the fact that you have to take her seriously. She does do. She's um, in that sense an osteologist, um, with opinions that have been very carefully thought out with rigor and with with due respect as well. And yeah, so intent. I've said it several times now, but it has to come down to intent, surely.
So, are there any final thoughts you have for our audience other than you will, because you've watched my video all this way through, go follow Archaeosoup if you don't already.
Yeah.
Then where are you at, as they say on TikTok? If you're not following Archaeosoup, where are you at? Apparently that's another one of these many memes that goes around that I haven't done, but I've done it now. There you are.
Yeah. Obviously YouTube, TikTok, not Twitter really anymore.
No.
Blue Sky, Facebook. You can find Archaeosoup. I think the final thoughts that I would be remiss not to acknowledge right now at the time and place that I'm at is that I am a bit tired, and it's one of the things I was complaining about actually the other day on Blue Sky was the fact that archaeology sometimes has an issue with a sort of toxic positivity. And if you look at the definition of toxic positivity, it's not just a sort of a mushiness. It's actually a very specific instance of dismissing legitimate concerns of other people and other people's experiences for the sake of one's own happiness. And the idea that if they could just be happy like you, everything would be fine. And I am in that sense a little bit worried by some of the conversations that happen in and around archaeology, some of the weird inconsistencies about diversity of opinion, about work and paying conditions, about the value of the work that we do, can tie you up in knots. And especially having been essentially throughout what I would, I suppose I should call a career, throughout my career, I have been interested in those issues. It's quite disappointing to see how little some of those things have changed, and the thing is, some of those things haven't changed for long before I was born, even, in terms of how archaeology is done, and what we expect from archaeology as a career. So I suppose what I would say is I'm tired. I'm looking for ways to renew enthusiasm and to maybe do the equivalent of an A to Z series again.
That'd be fun.
Something which is
Z to A.
Exactly. A to Z. Something which is about the love of doing archaeology and being an archaeologist, as opposed to dealing with archaeologists.
But isn't it fair to say that there's I saw a geographer doing a video recently about our workplaces more generally demand us to be socially positive all the time. It's like yeah, that was a great report that you never submitted and did it on time, but I'm not allowed to say that. I have to go, wow, wonderful shoes, and hey, let's talk about this. What did you do at the weekend? And I and then by the way, that report you never submitted that you were supposed to kind of, and whether it's that kind of thing or it's discussing, you're not allowed to look critical, you're not allowed to look angry, you've got to. And I know that people from particular demographics have a much more demanding expectations, particularly women of color. You must not be fitted to a stereotype of being a complainer, because that's but we have to address some of these issues in a candid way. So I understand that sense of exhaustion.
And but at the same time, as I recently was questioning myself and put this question out there publicly, I do still want to do it. I do still want to be an archaeologist, and I am continuing with Archaeosoup. But it's good. I think what I hope, what I'm hopeful for, is that people will start to more commonly ask these questions and not pardon me, and also expect better. Expect career paths that are clearly laid out. Expect to be able to talk about wages openly and publicly. and not settle for what's come before, because that's what we've always done. I have hope of that. I'm sure that many of the God, I nearly said the kids. Many of the young people who you
These young
teach.
people today, they've got no respect.
Many of the so Mrs. Soup and I often we're at an age now where we're realizing we're probably closer to middle age. Well, we are closer to middle age than we are to being teenagers, obviously. And when you find yourself going, young people, you just feel so. But I know I have hope. I have hope that hopefully the tone of conversation will shift, and in that sense, as you say, being there for 14 years and being a place where people can learn, but also people can explore some of the realities of being an archaeologist, will hopefully be useful, and be a good thing. So yeah, hopefully that's not too negative a point to be ending on.
No.
But I guess we all need to acknowledge when a little bit of a mental slowdown is required, and that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Fair enough, Mark.
Yeah.
And obviously we'll put the description in the description, all of the details of where to find you and where to buy all the merch.
Yeah, the merch.
and please stay with it. It's fantastic following all the content, and it's a real inspiration to me. You got me started with both example and specific advice back in 2020 on my attempts at videos, and I'm very indebted and appreciative of all that, Mark. And you've stayed at it through, and whether it's not about just followers, it's about presence and being a reliable authority and perspective in this digital space, which matters more than how many interactions you get in any given day, in my opinion. And I think in that regard, you've done such a successful contribution to the discipline, as well as to not just digital public archaeology as a sub field, but to archaeology as a whole. Even if no one thanks you, which I think there's so much of what we do doesn't get that sort of overt recognition, but I think it's important to recognize. And I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been great.
You're very welcome. That's been fun. Thank you. And yeah, onwards and upwards, deathlings.
Yay! Thank you. Take care.
Will do.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.